Hello traders, welcome to the Nexoel Trading Hub YouTube channel. So we're going to be looking at the weekly forecast for the coming week. If you guys have been following us, you guys have been benefiting from the weekly Forex forecast we make available in the YouTube channel. So now we're going to start from the dollar index, and this is the monthly time frame. So you guys know about the monthly bullish fair value gap we saw here and how the month of June, the volume closed below the monthly bullish fair value gap. And we're anticipating to see bullish movement to the upside, and price would react to that as an inversion fair value gap if we want to continue bearish in the dollar index. That is, if we're seeing the bearish momentum still being maintained. So now we can see that in the month of July, which we're still in the month of July, price has traded to the upside, but yet to even trade higher into the consequent encroachment of the monthly inversion fair value gap. So for the coming week, we're still looking forward to the possibility of bullish movements before any form of bearish movement to the downside, or we could see price continues bullish to the upside. So we're going to drop to the weekly time frame to look at the narrative from the weekly time frame. So here in the weekly time frame, if you guys can vividly remember from the weekly Forex forecast last week, we look at how price reacted from the weekly bullish fair value gap, which you can clearly see that here. So price traded to the downside into this as a draw on liquidity, and clearly we can see the bullish reaction to the upside. So price gave this bullish rejection when price mitigated the weekly bullish fair value gap. And last week we called out this bullish movement. We want to see how price was going to trade into the monthly inversion fair value gap. So what we can see clearly here is the fact that when price traded into this monthly bullish fair value gap, which we can also see here in the weekly time frame, this is the zone in the weekly time frame, we can see that we have this bullish reaction to the upside. So what we are looking forward to see is the possibility that we might still see another bullish reaction to the upside, because now we can see that price coming from a mitigated weekly bullish fair value gap, now returning into the monthly inversion fair value gap, and price have not traded into the consequent encroachments. What we can now see is this is the last up close candle before we have the bearish movement of price to the downside. So we could still see higher prices, looking forward to the consequent encroachment of this bearish order block here in the weekly time frame, before we could look now to the possibility of a bearish movement. So it means that I'll be looking at the possibility of seeing price trade more higher, and what price does here in a lower time frame will determine if we're going to go bearish, or then we could see price continue bullish to seek this buy side liquidity. But let's check the daily time frame. So here in the daily time frame, clearly from last week I told us we're anticipating to see how price is going to come into this liquidity gap here, and we can see how price have traded to the upside into the liquidity gap. So next we have is this liquidity gap resting here, and this liquidity gap resting here we can see is also just within the monthly inversion fair value gap. And we have an inversion fair value gap here in the daily time frame. Now we can see that volume has filled up this liquidity gap, and we can see how volume closed above that. So we could see the possibility of that bullish continuation. So what I'll be looking forward to see is the possibility that we could see price return to retest this, and then we have that bullish reaction to the upside. So when price trades to this zone here, this liquidity gap, then we're not going to jump bearish immediately. We'll have to wait to see the model that will be formed in lower time frame, and that would help us determine if we're going to see a bearish fall of price to the downside, or we could now see that price may just continue bullish. So it means that from the daily time frame, we have this draw on liquidity to the upside here, and we have a daily inversion fair value gap here. So we'll be looking forward to see how price trade higher to this zone here, which is also within the monthly inversion fair value gap. So whatever reaction we have here from the lower time frame, the 1 hour time frame, 15-minute time frame, then that would help us determine the possibility of us seeing the bearish continuation, or we could see price continue higher to seek this buy side liquidity. But working with the fact that we are in a bearish structure in the dollar index, this is what we're going to be looking at. We may see how price would continue further into the zone, and then we have to wait to see what happens here. Price may decide to go bullish, or now price will continue bearish to the downside, because clearly now what we can see in the market is that the dollar index is greatly affected by the economic factors. So this is what I have to show us in the dollar index. Let's check that from the 4-hour time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame, what we can see clearly, you can see we have that liquidity gap we identify also from the daily time frame. Here in the 4-hour, we have that. And now we can see prices trading higher. Now price is reacting at this 4-hour bearish fair value gap, which I pointed out towards last week and the order block. So we could see a reaction to the downside. Price will seek this sell side liquidity, mitigate at this bullish order block, and then we have that bullish continuation to the upside. So you can see from the 4-hour time frame, what we can see is that we may see that possibility of a higher bullishness to the upside, because we can see that we have this fair value gap here in the 4-hour time frame. Price took out this equal highs and then the bearish to the downside. So price would want to seek this buy side liquidity, an engineered liquidity here, and then we could see price trade more higher into this fair value gap before we have the possibility of looking at a bearish movement to the downside. So this is the narrative from the 4-hour time frame. So this is what I have to show us in the dollar index. Let's check out the EURUSD pair, guys. Here in EURUSD, last week we anticipated to see that bearish movement of price to the downside into the weekly bullish fair value gap, which we can clearly see from the weekly time frame, because we saw the mitigation of the weekly bearish fair value gap and bearish order block from the weekly time frame, and we saw how price was respecting those zones and closed below the consequent encroachment of both zones. That is the weekly bearish fair value gap and the mitigation of the weekly bearish order block. So we anticipated that bearish movement back into this liquidity here, which is the weekly bullish fair value gap zone. And we can clearly see how price have traded into that. Though price have not traded into the consequent encroachment, the main threshold of the weekly bullish fair value gap. And we can see clearly that last week volume closed below the low of this bullish candle. So we could see the possibility of further dip of price to the downside before we can frame the possibility of a bullish continuation, or we could see price trade more lower to the downside. So let's check the daily time frame. Here in the daily time frame, what we can clearly see within the weekly bullish fair value gap zone, during a session with one of the mentees last week, I pointed to the fact that we have this first as the draw on liquidity within the weekly bullish fair value gap. So we have this daily bullish fair value gap as the zone we want to see how price is going to trade lower into. Now we can also see that still within the weekly bullish fair value gap, in the daily time frame, we have this daily bullish fair value gap. And we know that the fall of price here has not reached the main threshold of the weekly bullish fair value gap. So we may see that possibility of bearish continuation to the downside, because we also have this daily bullish fair value gap to the downside within the weekly bullish fair value gap. So for the coming week, still yet, I'll be looking forward to see how price dips more lower, because in the lower time frame, what we're going to be seeing is the bearish structure. So I'll be looking to the possibility of further push of price to the downside, first into the zone, and then we can begin to look at the possibility if price is going to give us bullish narrative in lower time frame, then we can now go bullish in EURUSD. But for now, we'll be holding to the possibility of what lower prices in the EURUSD. So let's check the 4-hour time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame, what we can see is you can see the bearish structure. I called that a position for us from last week forecast that we should wait to see reaction and then we go bearish to the downside. And we can see how price has been falling to the downside, volume closing below the low points. So what we have now is this is the last high point that price now fell to the downside here after mitigating this rejection block. So we can see we have this unmitigated institutional order flow zone here in the 4-hour time frame. So we have a bearish fair value gap resting here, and this is the last up close candle before this bearish fall into this first daily bullish fair value gap. So for the coming week, I'll be looking at this possibility in the EURUSD. So it is either we see price comes into this 4-hour bearish fair value gap in confluence to this last up close candle before the bearish movement, and then we see price continues bearish to the downside into this institutional order flow zone. Or what we could see is, since we can see that here price took out this high point here, because we can see this is the up close candle before this bearish movement to the downside. Anyway, this movement did not take out this low, so price traded to the upside and volume closed below that. So we could see the bearish continuation to the downside. So you have to look at the lower time frame, like the 15-minute time frame, if that gives us the possibility that we could just see bearish continuation to the downside, or price may have to reach to the upside into this 4-hour fair value gap in confluence to this last up close candle before this bearish fall to the downside, to take out Friday's high points as a buy side liquidity, and then we have the bearish fall to the downside into this institutional order flow. So this is what I'll be looking forward to in the Euro USD, except we see volume trade strongly to the upside and then violates this bearish fair value gap in confluence with the last up close candle before the fall. Then we can now start looking at the possibility of higher prices to the upside. So this is what I have to show us in Euro USD. Let's check out the GBP USD pair, guys. So here in GBP USD, what we can clearly see is, we had that perspective 2 weeks ago to want to see price first seek this buy side. But I pointed to you guys from the daily, we saw price reacting at the main threshold of a supply zone. And then we anticipated now to see that last week would give us bearish continuation to the downside. So what we can see clearly now is that price has traded to the downside, and clearly we're seeing the possibility that price is aiming for the sell side liquidity. So in the GBP USD, from what we can clearly see here, the zone that price may really want to trade to is this block here that actually seeks this sell side liquidity, reacted from this weekly bullish fair value gap and sponsored this bullish movement. So price may violate this block here and seek the sell side to the downside. Let's check that clearly from the daily time frame. So here in the daily time frame, last 3 weeks, we anticipated to see price falls into this bullish fair value gap here in the daily time frame. So clearly what we can see is that volume have closed below the daily bullish fair value gap zone here. So we can see that Friday's candle, the volume closed below that. So clearly now, this is not really a clean, clear zone. All we can see is that we have this unmitigated weak. So in a lower time frame, we're going to find the possibility of fair value gap and a bullish order block here. So we can see this low took out sell side before continuing bullish. So we may have a form of price support here. Price may not really just fall straight forward to the downside. We may see price buys a little from this particular zone before we have the possibility of price dropping to the downside. So if price is seeking this sell side liquidity, what we have is that we have this daily bullish fair value gap resting here, because this low also sponsored the push of price to the upside that broke out this high points. So for the coming week, looking at the narrative here from the daily time frame, so we could see price gives us a push to the upside to mitigate this as an inversion, and then we may see the possibility of price falling bearish to the downside to seek out this sell side liquidity. But let's look at that from the 4-hour time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame in GBP USD, we have bullish fair value gap resting here and a bullish order block resting here. This took out sell side before bullish impulse that took out this high point. So this is the daily bullish fair value gap, and what we can see is that price violated that and traded to the downside. So clearly from the 4-hour time frame, we have this bearish fair value gap zone here and this unmitigated weak. So if we are bearish and we're going to continue bearish to the downside, then we may see the possibility that price may trade into this fair value gap, this unmitigated weak, and then we have our bearish continuation to the downside. So I'll be trading bearish first to this 4-hour bullish order block before the consideration that price may continue more lower to the downside into this daily bullish fair value gap. So except otherwise, and then price just gives us strong bullish movements, violating this up close candle before the bearish movement that sponsored the movement that closed below the daily bullish fair value gap, then we could start seeing the possibility of higher prices to the upside to seek this trend line liquidity resting here into this fair value gap. But we are going to be looking at the bearish continuation, except proven otherwise. So this is what I have to show us in GBPUSD, guys. So let's check out the other pairs. Here in US30, what we can see from the weekly time frame, we identified the all-time high and how price returned here to the bullish fair value gap and the bullish movement to the upside. Price reacted at this weekly bullish order block, and we can see bullish impulse. So clearly the draw on liquidity is the buy side liquidity resting here. So I told us last week to anticipate the possibility of a push of price to the downside before the bullish continuation to the upside. And what we can see is that price traded bearish, but anyway, price did not really dip more lower into the zone before continuing to the upside, or price closing above that zone. So we still have that possibility that anyway, we can see that prices formed a bullish fair value gap here. So for a deeper pullback from the weekly time frame, we want to see how price trades to the downside before we have the bullish continuation to the upside. So let's check the daily time frame to look at the structure from the daily time frame. So here in the daily time frame, if you can vividly remember, last week I pointed the fact that we had this bullish fair value gap from the daily time frame, and we could see that bullish reaction from that bullish fair value gap. But anyway, what we can see in US30 is that volume is quite low. Price did not continue bullish to take out the high here and also to the draw on liquidity to the upside. What we can just see is that price traded here to the upside. Volume now closed below the volume of this up close candle. Now what we can see is that now price return to retest this candle week, and we are seeing volume trading to the downside. So basically we have a draw on liquidity resting here to the downside, which is the sell side liquidity. So from the daily time frame, we may see the possibility of price dipping lower before we have the bullish continuation to the upside. So first we have this daily bullish fair value gap within the weekly zone. So we could see how price reacts here. So this is the first draw on liquidity within the weekly zone. If price is trading to the downside, we have this zone here before we could now anticipate the possibility of any bullish continuation. So this is what I have to show us in US30 from the daily time frame. Let's check the 4-hour time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame, clearly what we can see is the daily bullish fair value gap. And last week I told us we would want to see price seek this sell side, and we may have bullish reaction here. And now what we can see is that price traded back into this, and now we are seeing the possibility that price is aiming to the downside again. So I'm looking at how price is going to dip into this zone here. We have this sell side liquidity resting. This could just be a deeper fall. So I'll be working first with, let's get back to the daily time frame to mark out something. Let's look at this fair value gap here in the daily time frame within the weekly zone, and let's check that in the 4-hour time frame. So in the 4-hour time frame, this is it, and we have this candle wick. So we have to see how price first drop into the zone before considering a bullish movement to the upside. So this is what I have to show us in the US30. Let's check out the NASDAQ and other pairs, guys. Here in NASDAQ, as identified from last week, we saw price from this bullish order block sponsored the bullishness, and then we saw how price took out this all-time high point. So clearly what we can see is we identified the weekly bullish fair value gap. We wanted to see a deeper fall of price into that before the possibility of a bullish continuation to the upside. But anyway, what we can see is that here we have an indecision candle. So this is quite trickish. But anyway, we can see that price took out this high point first, price took out buy side, and then volume closed below. So for us to have our bullish continuation, we may see this possibility of price deep into the zone before the bullish continuation to the upside. This is the narrative from the weekly time frame. Let's check the daily time frame. So here in the daily time frame, what we can clearly see is price just consolidated last week. So price was just respecting this bullish order block. So what we can see is price was just trading within this bullish order block and failing to create bullish impulse to the upside. So it means that if price doesn't continue bullish to the upside, and then we begin to see price fall into the downside, then we'd want to see price falls into the zone before we have the possibility of the bullish continuation to the upside. So we can see within the weekly bullish fair value gap zone, we have the daily bullish fair value gap zone and this unmitigated institutional order flow zone. So this is the NASDAQ from the daily time frame. Let's check the 4-hour time frame. So last week, in the 4-hour time frame, we identified this bullish fair value gap where it told us that we would have to wait to see what happens there. If price trades there with strong volume, then we may fall to the downside. But if we see price respecting this, then this is the reason to go bullish. This zone is where we would go bullish. And clearly, price gave us a very clear picture of that because we saw price traded to the bullish fair value gap. And now we can see an engulfing candle. So basically now we have drawn liquidity resting here and then this draw on liquidity. So we're waiting for the return to the downside for the mitigation and then the bullish movement to the upside to seek this buy side liquidity. So upon seeking this buy side liquidity, price then fell to the downside. So here again, what we can just see is that now price fell to the downside, still respecting the daily order block. And what we can now see, we have this is the last down close candle, and now we have bullish impulse. So we have to wait to see how price reacted this candle. The violation of this candle will mean that we're going to see price trade more lower to the downside before any bullish movements. So this is what I have to show us in the NASDAQ. This is S&P 500 and this is the weekly time frame in S&P 500. So S&P 500, we can also see reaction from the weekly bullish order block and we start seeing bullish momentum to the upside, creating a new all-time high. Price took out the old all-time high and we can see just in confluence to the US30, the NASDAQ, we can also see we have a weekly bullish fair value gap resting here. So also in S&P 500, what we can see is that price seek the buy side liquidity, volume closed below that. So clearly from the weekly time frame, we're looking forward to the possibility of price dipping into the weekly bullish fair value gap here, and then we have the bullish continuation to the upside. So price has taken out this all-time high, so price may return to retest the all-time high before we have the possibility of a bullish continuation. So this is the narrative from the weekly time frame. When we now look at the daily time frame, what we can see from the daily time frame is within the weekly bullish fair value gap zone, we also have the daily bullish fair value gap zone, and this daily bullish fair value gap zone is in confluence to the consequent encroachment of the weekly bullish fair value gap. So what we can see also in the S&P 500 is that price just gave this consolidated movement. Price failed to create a new high. Price just swept to the side and now price fell to the downside. So volume failed to close above this and now we can see volume trading to the downside. So we may have that fall of price to the downside before the bullish movement. So we may see price dip into this before we look at the possibility of a bullish movement to the upside. So let's look at that in the 4-hour time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame, we must understand that weeks are also sponsorship zone. Now this came to the downside, taking out all these low points, this candle low point sell side before we had the bullish movement. So what we can see last week is just the way price respected the bullish fair value gap zone in the NASDAQ and the US30. What we can see in S&P is that price returned to this bullish order block and then we had bullish movement to the upside, taking out this sell side liquidity and bullish movement to the upside. So clearly now in the S&P, we have this bearish fair value gap resting here. So looking at the narrative we're seeing in the dollar index, so we may see that possibility that price will dip more lower to the downside. So this is our first zone to consider price dropping into and possibly giving us a buy model from this zone. So it means if we are going bearish, we want to see how price violates the low points and then we look at price trading to the downside. And if we don't have a buy model here, then the next zone is this zone within the weekly zone. So clearly this is what I'll be looking out for in S&P 500, except we see that price gives us bullish impulse to the upside and then we can now go bullish to the upside. So this is the narrative I have, or the forecast I have for S&P 500, guys. So let's check out the gold pair and then we also look at other pairs for the coming week. Here in gold from the weekly time frame, what we can see is gold has quite been trickish, that's the truth, in correlation to the dollar index. So what we can see now is last week I pointed the fact that we want to anticipate bullish movement. So we have that bullish movement. And I told us where we are to look at price selling to and then the buy zone to buy to the upside. So price traded to that zone twice and then bought. We're going to look at that from the 4-hour time frame. So we can see now this is the external range liquidity that price has left. Price did not trade to the upside to seek this, and we saw how price trade bearish. And now price did not seek this low, creating relatively equal lows, and then failed to still take out the sell side. Price went to the upside. So clearly now what we're just seeing is price possibly aiming for this buy side liquidity. So from the weekly time frame, we can't really just point out a clear anticipation, aside from the fact that price here took out this previous weekly low point and now traded to the upside, and now we could see price take out the high points, the buy side liquidity. So let's check the daily time frame. So in the daily time frame, what we can clearly see from the daily time frame is price now traded to the upside, volume closing above this bearish candle, and now we can see price traded to the downside, returning to mitigate this and bullish push to the upside. So from the daily time frame, we can also see the fact that now price have traded above this bearish candle. So for us to have bullish continuation, then price should respect this bearish zone that price has closed above. So we could see that we could anticipate the possibility of price retesting that and then bullish continuation to the upside. This would be the first target, this buy side, before aiming for this other buy side liquidity resting here. So this is just what I have to show us in the gold pair, except price then decides to continue bearish. But then I'll be holding to this narrative to look at how price reacts at this zone. If we have a clear reason to just continue bullish, then we continue bullish to the upside in gold. Let's check the 4-hour time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame, what we can clearly see is last week this was the zone I called out first to anticipate to see how gold was going to drop to that, and then we buy from that zone. So this is the zone we marked from the daily time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame, we have this. So it means a deeper fall will be falling into the 4-hour zone, and then we have the bullish continuation to the upside. Looking at this liquidity pool resting here for us to have price trades higher, and then you can see we have this bearish fair value gap resting here first in the 4-hour time frame. So this is my perspective for gold, except price violates this and then we see price trades lower and we can now start trading to the downside. So let's check out USDJPY pair. Here in USDJPY, so we can see that price is bullish in the USDJPY pair. So clearly now we can see this bullish momentum to the upside. This was the buy movement we actually analyzed past few weeks for us to see price trade into this bearish fair value gap. And now we can see how price traded into that and fell. And what we can now see is price return to retest that. This candle return to retest that and then closed below that. And so we had the anticipation that we may see bearish continuation, but then price consolidated for, I think, 4 weeks. And then now finally price is giving this bullish momentum to the upside. So clearly it means if we're going to have a bullish continuation, looking at this bullish momentum, then we'll be looking forward to see how price gives us a pullback, and then we have the bullish continuation to the upside still into this fair value gap zone, and we have this bearish order block. So we have this fair value gap zone not fully mitigated. Price traded into it, yeah, and then we had rejection. So we could see bullish continuation to the upside in the USDJPY. Looking at also the narrative we established from the dollar index, let's check the daily time frame to have a clear picture to that. So here in the daily time frame, what we can clearly see in the daily time frame is we have this movement of price to the upside. So this was our delivery last week, bullishness. So from the daily time frame, we can clearly see that price gave us a pullback here and then the bullish continuation to the upside. So it means if we're going to have a deeper pullback, it means price will seek this sell side liquidity into this fair value gap, and then we have the continuation. So clearly what I mean is we have fair value gap resting here. Let's identify that. So it means if price is going to give us a deeper pullback from the daily time frame, then we have price dipping into this zone for the bullish continuation to take out last week low points, and then we have this bullishness. So anyway, this is not last week low point. This is actually the delivery on Thursday. So price will take out Thursday's low, and then we have the push of price to the upside. So clearly we can also classify that as a low from last week. So this is my anticipation in the USDJPY based on the daily time frame, but then we have to look at the zone. Price may really respect the zone and continue bullish to the upside. Let's check out the 4-hour time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame, what we can clearly see from the 4-hour time frame is the fact that now price have dipped to the downside, taking out this low, price traded to the upside, and now we can see that price traded above this bearish order block. Volume here closed above that, and we still have bullish momentum to the upside. So in the 4-hour time frame, this is where we have our bullish order block. So clearly now from the 4-hour time frame, we may be looking at this, and then we have the bullish continuation to the upside, except price decides to continue bullish from this fair value gap zone. So clearly we have two zones. We have this, and then we have this 4-hour zone. Price may not necessarily dip lower to the downside here. So we have this zone, and we have this from the 4-hour time frame. So this is what I have to show us in USDJPY. Cheers till I come your way next week, and God bless you all.